past summer, I got a call from a woman named Ellie, and she had heard about the family separations at the southern border and wanted to know what she could do to help. She told me the story of her grandfather and his father. When they were kids in Poland, their father, fearing for his son's safety, gave them a little bit of money and told them to walk west, to just keep walking west across Europe. And they did. They walked all the way west across Europe, and they got on a boat and they got to America.
Huh. And did this story, by any chance, take place during a time and under the circumstances of war or religious or ethnic persecution? You know, a situation that far exceeded mere economic hardship? I'm just curious. I have no idea why I am asking that.
Ellie said that when she heard the stories of the teens walking up across Mexico, all she could think about was her grandfather and his brother. She said that for her, the stories were exactly the same.
Well, your friend Ellie has a very loose definition of the word exactly.
I'm telling you this story because it made me think about whether I would have the faith or the courage to send my teens, and I have 3 of them, on a journey like that.
The faith and courage to send your teenage children out thousands of miles over several international boundaries on foot with no protection, no money, and leaving their fate up to any strangers they might encounter along the way in the hopes that, by luck, they would survive to make it to a very specific border? Yeah, that would require a lot of faith. Courage? I'm not so sure about that one.
Knowing that they wouldn't be safe where we were, would I be able to watch them go?
So they're not safe where they are. Are they not safe where they are because of a state of war or due to persecution by their home governments? I really have no idea why I am asking that.
I started my career decades ago at the southern US border working with Central American asylum seekers. And in the last 16 years, I've been at HIAS, the Jewish organization that fights for refugee rights around the world, as a lawyer and an advocate.
Well, and I do mean this sincerely. Thank you for letting us know where you are coming from on this subject.
And one thing I've learned is that sometimes the things that we're told make us safer and stronger actually don't. And in fact, some of these policies have the opposite of the intended results, and in the meantime, cause tremendous and unnecessary suffering.
Okay, I guess we're getting started. So, what policies are you referring to?
So why are people showing up at our southern border?
Primarily economic migrants who are fleeing broken, corrupt, and destitute countries. Oh, did I spoil the ending?
Most of the immigrants and refugees that are coming to our southern border are fleeing 3 countries: Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. These countries are consistently ranked among the most violent countries in the world. It's very difficult to be safe in these countries, let alone build a future for yourself and your family.
I notice that neither of those reasons are racial, religious, ethnic, or political persecution. Safety is a bit subjective, and building a future sounds awfully economic. And save for a very well-made case regarding the former, the latter, by itself, is not a legal excuse to cross the US border and qualify for asylum.
And violence against women and girls is pervasive.
Are you meaning to imply that violence against men and boys is thus uncommon?
People have been fleeing Central America for generations. Generations of refugees have been coming to our shores, fleeing the civil wars of the 1980s, in which the United States was deeply involved.
Stipulated. So, is it still the 1980s by any chance?
This is nothing new. What's new is that recently there's been a spike in families, children and families, showing up at checkpoints and presenting themselves to seek asylum. Now, this has been in the news lately, so I want you to remember a few things as you see those images. One, this is not a historically high level of interceptions at the southern border, and in fact, people are presenting themselves at checkpoints.
Really? Because according to the United Nations, as of 2018, the US is the global leader in asylum requests, having seen a 27% rise from 2016 to 2017, reaching 331,700 requests. Compare that with just 10 years prior, when the number of requests amounted to 48,217. Oh, and that's only counting the documented requests for asylum. There are no sure numbers on how many people have or have attempted to cross the border illegally on top of that. But none of this constitutes a historically high number of intercepts at the southern border, you say.
This is not a historically high level of interceptions at the southern border, and in fact, people are presenting themselves at checkpoints.
Got it. But, okay, your first point is that we need to keep in mind, when seeing images of families at the border, is that it isn't historically out of the ordinary. So you say. All right, so what is the second thing that we need to keep in mind?
Two, people are showing up with the clothes on their backs. Some of them are literally in flip-flops.
And what does that have to do with anything?
And three, we're the most powerful country in the world.
And what does that have to do with anything?
It's not a time to panic.
It's not a time to panic. Well, you might want to tell that to the hyperbolics out there accusing border protection of killing children and running concentration camps. Or maybe you should tell that to the friends and loved ones of people injured or killed by those having arrived in this country illegally, some of whom had already been deported on multiple occasions in the past. But sure, it's no time to panic.
It's not a time to panic. It's easy from the safety of the destination country to think in terms of absolutes. Is it legal or is it illegal?
It is not a matter of easy. It is a matter of being pragmatic. Either our laws mean something or they do not. Either they are meant to be followed or they are not. Either we are trying to curtail crimes like human trafficking and encourage legal immigration, or we are not.
But the people who are wrestling with these questions and making these decisions about their families are thinking about very different questions. How do I keep my daughter safe? How do I protect my son?
Well, obviously, the way to protect your children is to send them off alone into the wilderness without any money, on foot, without any protection, to cross international boundaries all by themselves. Or, better yet, carry them into a rushing river on the hopes that you will be able to cross the border illegally, because that is how you protect your children.
And if you want absolutes, it's absolutely legal to seek asylum. It is a fundamental right in our own laws and in international law. And in fact,
Indeed. The ability to request asylum at a port of entry is a right, and it is the law. Being granted asylum, however, is not a right and can be refused.
It stems from the 1951 Refugee Convention, which was the world's response to the Holocaust, and a way for countries to say never again would we return people to countries where they would be harmed or killed.
Harmed or killed? Is that the legal standard? Because I don't see either of those things listed in the law that you are citing there. And you are a lawyer, aren't you?
And in the last 16 years, I've been at HIAS as a lawyer and an advocate.
Regardless, a case for asylum has to be made by each applicant, and it is a relatively high bar to jump to validate such a claim without very good evidence.
There are several ways refugees come to this country. One is through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And through that program, the U.S. identifies and selects refugees abroad and brings them to the United States. Last year, the U.S. resettled fewer refugees than at any time since the program began in 1980. And this year, it'll probably be less.
So, the numbers of refugees the United States willfully selected to come here has been shrinking. Got it.
And this is at a time when we have more refugees in the world than at any other time in recorded history, even since World War II.
We have seen the legal definition of refugee, but I am not certain what you mean when you say refugee. If someone unable to build a future for their family qualifies as a refugee in our speaker's mind, the number of refugees in the world is indeed very, very large. And you know, I can think of certain communities in America just chock full of refugees in that case.
Another way that refugees come to this country is by seeking asylum. Asylum seekers are people who present themselves at a border and say that they'll be persecuted if they're sent back home.
Yes. Asylum is all you've been talking about during this presentation. Did I miss something?
An asylum seeker is simply somebody who's going through the process in the United States to prove that they meet the refugee definition.
The operative word there being prove.
And it's never been more difficult to seek asylum. Border guards are telling people when they show up at our borders that our country's full, that they simply can't apply. This is unprecedented and illegal.
You know, it is very interesting that in reference to asylum seekers, you would use a photo of a woman who attempted to enter the U.S. illegally, along with her daughter, whom she had taken from Honduras without the father's knowledge. Oh, but we're not meant to consider facts here, so much as we are arguments to emotion. My bad. And as far as border agents denying people the ability to apply for asylum, I am going to need a citation or two, because you are not proving yourself to be a reliable source thus far.
Under a new program with the kind of Orwellian title, Migrant Protection Protocols, refugees are told they have to wait in Mexico while their cases make their way through the courts in the United States, and this can take months or years. Meanwhile, they're not safe, and they have no access to lawyers.
First off, they are not refugees by any legal definition, unless or until that status has been affirmed through the asylum process. Secondly, the months or years aspect is going to be true regardless on which side of the border they are waiting, specifically because the migrant situation is so out of control. And third, at least as of the time I am writing this, the policy has been affirmed as legal by, of all entities, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Seeking asylum is a right. being provided living space in the US during that process is not.
Our country, our government, has detained over 3,000 children, separating them from their parents' arms as a deterrent from seeking asylum. Many were toddlers, and at least one was a 6-year-old blind girl. And this is still going on.
Again, I find it interesting that you would keep displaying a photo depicting a situation where the mother and child were not separated from one another. But in those instances where children and adults are separated, I wonder if our speaker can affirm that in each and every case, the child in question actually belonged to the adults they were with. I wonder if our speaker is willing to say that children and parents should never be separated if their parents are arrested for a crime.
We spend billions to detain people in what are virtually prisons who have committed no crime.
So, people who show up at the border seeking to go through a legal process of determining refugee status should just, what? Be waved through without processing them to confirm their identities, make sure they're not fugitives from their home countries, or make sure they are not victims or perpetrators of human trafficking?
And family separation has become the hallmark of our immigration system. That's a far cry from a shining city on a hill or a beacon of hope or all of the other ways we like to talk about ourselves and our values.
Values like, I don't know, following the law? Values like trying to deter people from risking theirs or their children's lives in trying to come to this country illegally? Or are the values you are arguing for something akin to lowered oversight and open borders? Because I am hearing a lot of complaints, but I am not hearing any alternative and better solutions. But then, a solution would necessitate a problem. And since we're not having a historical surge of asylum seekers, I guess there is no problem.
This is not a historically high level of interceptions at the southern border, and in fact, people are presenting themselves at checkpoints. Migration has always been with us, and it always will be. The reasons why people flee: persecution, war, violence, climate change.
Oh, so now climate change is included in the same list as war and religious persecution? Got it.
And the ability now to see on your phone what life is like in other places, those pressures are only growing.
Well, maybe those other places need to work to fix what is wrong with their own countries, then. I know. It is such a cruel notion to suggest.
But there are ways that we can have policies that reflect our values and actually make sense given the reality in the world.
All right, I am ready to be educated. What policies do you suggest we adopt to solve the entirely non-crisis at the border that is still a crisis at the border?
The first thing we need to do is dial back the toxic rhetoric that has been the basis of our national debate on this issue for too long.
Stop saying subjectively mean words. Got it.
Global cooperation as a response to global migration and displacement would go a long way towards making migration something that isn't a crisis, but something that just is, and that we deal with as a global community.
So we should be shipping people who come to our border to Australia or something? So that everyone can share the load?
Humanitarian aid is also critical. The amount of support we provide to countries in Central America that are sending refugees and migrants is a tiny fraction of the amount we spend on enforcement and detention.
So we should be throwing more money at the countries that you say are the most deadly and violent because that will stop them from being deadly and violent? And we should reduce the amount we spend on our own national security. Is that what I am to understand?
And we can absolutely have an asylum system that works.
I am still waiting to hear how.
For a tiny fraction of the cost of a wall, we could hire more judges, make sure asylum seekers have lawyers, and commit to a humane asylum system.
So now you want us to throw more money at our border and immigration system? And immigration judges and lawyers are just growing on trees, I take it? You want to increase the efficiency of processing people's cases. Well, in spirit, I do not disagree with that notion. However, and I do hate to tell you this, that will not make invalid claims of asylum suddenly valid, nor will it discourage people from putting theirs and their children's lives at risk to reach the border. Why not invest something in the part of our immigration system that handles legal, non-asylum immigration?
And we could resettle more refugees. To give you a sense of the decline in the refugee program, 3 years ago, the US resettled 15,000 Syrian refugees in response to the largest refugee crisis on earth. A year later, that number was 3,000, and last year, that number was 62 people. 62 people.
62? Wow, that is a small number of Syrian refugees. I mean, I notice you focused in specifically on Syrian refugees accepted last year. Well, what about other refugees that we accepted last year? In fiscal year 2018, October 1st, 2017 to September 30th, 2018, a total of 22,491 refugees were resettled in the United States under a refugee ceiling of 45,000. You know, 22,491 seems a little bit more than 62. Also, the top 5 countries of origin were the Congo, Myanmar, the Ukraine, Bhutan, and Eritrea. So, please do tell me how accepting and resettling refugees from legitimate, war-ravaged places like the Congo and the Ukraine, and even Syria, is going to alleviate the influx of migrants from Honduras and El Salvador. Because I would be really interested in hearing our speaker's answer to that one.
Despite the harsh rhetoric and efforts to block immigration, keep refugees out of the country, support for refugees and immigrants in this country, according to polls, has never been higher. Organizations like HIAS, where I work, and other humanitarian and faith-based organizations make it easy for you to take a stand when there's a law that's worth opposing, or a law that's worth supporting, or a policy that needs oversight. If you have a phone, you can do something. And if you want to do more, you can. I will tell you that if you see one of these detention centers along the border with children in them, their jails, you will never be the same.
And if you feel that way, and you want to work to change the laws to achieve the outcomes you desire, I sincerely wish you all of the luck in the world. I would just hope that you wouldn't attempt to manipulate people with half-truths and falsehoods. But hey, you do you.
What I loved so much about my call with Ellie was that she knew at her core that the stories of her grandparents were no different than today's stories, and she wanted to do something about it. If I leave you with one thing, it's that a country shows strength through compassion and pragmatism, not through force and through fear.
Pragmatism? Maybe I missed something, but I wasn't hearing much pragmatism in this presentation. No concessions to the other side of the argument, no positions based on compromise. All I was really hearing were complaints and arguments to emotion, without any alternative solutions offered.
A country is strong when it says to the refugee, not go away, but it's okay. We've got you. You're safe. Thank you.
A country is strong when it has laws that people abide by. A country is strong when it has defined borders that say, past this point, this is a sovereign nation, and you will respect that. The United States is not a day spa. We are not here to take care of people. Coming here is not an instantaneous cure for all that ails the rest of the world. Our sovereignty only means as much as the degree to which we are vigilant about defending and protecting it, and enforcing our laws, and holding those that live in or come to our country to follow those laws, citizen or otherwise, is a big part of defending that sovereignty. Now, you will not see me argue against legal immigration, from simply having a temporary work visa, to working towards becoming a full citizen, to lawfully seeking asylum at a port of entry. But I do not support the hand-waving away of illegal immigration, which only encourages people to risk their lives, as well as encouraging criminals to exploit the vulnerable. And I do not accept our speaker's generous redefinition of refugee to include people merely facing economic struggles. Asylum is meant for the most desperate and the most victimized, those fleeing the horrors of war, persecution, and natural disasters. There are gray areas to how those are defined, certainly, and the validity of such claims is what the asylum process is there to assess. But the growing crisis at the southern border and the demonstrable issues with our asylum system being overwhelmed are not going to be curtailed by policing bad words, doling out false statistics, or increasing the acceptance of refugees from the Congo. I really do wish that our speaker had offered some actual, alternative, or innovative solutions for what is taking place at the border. But she didn't. And unless or until better ideas are offered, all the well-meaning activism in the world is not going to change anything. As always, thank you for watching.